Well, Professor Pinker, welcome to the RSA.
Thank
We're
you.
very, very pleased to be welcoming you here, and thank you for agreeing to this brief interview. You talked about those organs of computation, or those modules being evolved to cope with our ancestral environment, and it seems to me that not in your work, but in the work of others, that's often led to a rather sort of deterministic sort of view of behaviour. But I was wondering whether you thought that does the fact that our minds, our brains are evolved to cope with a sort of Pleistocene sort of savannah, hunter-gatherer existence, does that mean that there is what you might call a cognitive gap between the sort of type of brains we have and the world we live in now? I mean, it's this sort of common idea of we're stuck in the digital age with Stone Age brains.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered whether you shared that view, and if so, what type of things would that make our brains bad at? What would be the particular challenges?
Yeah, it may not necessarily be the Pleistocene and the Stone Age, because recent evidence on selective pressures on the genome suggests that selection may have continued until quite a bit more recently. But it certainly is an environment that is very, very much unlike that of the 21st century. And I think the discrepancy between the environment that our minds evolved to work in and the ones that we're faced with now makes a huge difference in many realms of life. Perhaps the most obvious is the obesity epidemic, where our taste for sugar and fats hasn't caught up to an environment in which those are plentiful rather than rare. But I think we also see it in education, that children, when they come to school, aren't blank slates waiting to be written on, but they have certain intuitions about how things work, and education has to consist not just of writing on a slate, but debugging the implicit theories that they walk into the classroom with to replace them with modern sophisticated theories. And even in social organization, many of the forms of organization that work best, so we've learned from history, run against the grain of human nature. Traditional societies are run along bloodlines, organized by nepotism. You trust your brother, your cousin, your nephew. You don't trust anyone else. A modern democracy, modern organizations say you don't hire your brother-in-law, you hire the best person for the job. You don't just stand shoulder to shoulder with people in your tribe or clan, but with fellow citizens of your country. Yeah. We're seeing that discrepancy in Iraq and everywhere in the world where tradition clashes with modernity.
I think that's very interesting, because what you're sort of arriving at there is also an analysis of how that sort of evolutionary perspective can help us to understand what we ought to do to live in the world now. You're not just saying, well, hey, we've got Stone Age brains, so nothing we can do about it. We're maladapted to the world we live in. You start to get to an understanding of how, well, if we're designed like this, then we should educate children in a certain way, or we should respond to that. And it becomes a sort of proactive, forward-looking.
That's right. It means it's always a bit of an uphill climb.
Yeah.
We do have to send kids to school, because left to their own devices, they won't rediscover Newton's laws. We do have to have safeguards against corruption and nepotism and cronyism, because left to their own devices, people will favor their friends and relatives. So the fact that we have these institutions that are constantly pushing against us is, I think, kind of evidence that we're not adapted to what we now realize to be the best way of running our affairs. And I think neuroanatomically, to put it very crudely, the reason that there is scope for change, for optimism, for social improvement is we've got the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex in particular, which can do things like anticipate the future, learn from the lessons of the past, inhibit instinctive tendencies. So we're really driving our prefrontal cortexes in order to improve our lot.
I was going to pick up on that point and ask you a bit about brain plasticity, because it seems to me that we know increasingly a lot about the ways in which our brain is plastic, the way in which experience leaves sort of traces in our synaptic functioning. If we have that on the one hand, but on the other hand we're saying, well, our minds are these sort of specialist sort of units that deal with it. How far can plasticity go? Is there a sort of limit on how far our brains can continue to develop and change in relation to experience? Or does that offer the possibility of sort of pushing through the sort of evolutionary purpose of those modules?
Oh, absolutely, there are limits. In fact, I think plasticity is kind of a crude metaphor for what happens in the brain, because it's not as if the brain is this lump of goo that just gets molded to some stamp coming in from the outside. It obviously has to have the ability to store information, to learn from experience, to adapt as the body changes, as the world changes. I tend to think these are ways for the brain to store information and to adapt itself to the environment rather than plasticity. So I don't see the ability of the brain to learn and the fact that we're born with some kind of innate organization as alternatives.
Right. The one fits within the other.
In fact, it would be a very stupid and clumsy brain that just went off on its way like a wind-up doll without ever taking information from the environment and factoring it into its plans and goals and behavior. Also, the fact that cognition is a combinatorial system. This is especially evident when you study language, where every sentence is a brand new combination of words in a new order, conveying a particular thought because it conforms to combinatorial rules. Well, language is that way because thought is that way. We can think new thoughts by combining old ones. And so even if evolution fitted us with a certain inventory of thoughts and ways of combining them, the possible output is a combinatorial explosion of possibilities. So there are always new thoughts that we can think, new solutions we can come up with to our problems.
But those combinatorial sort of responses, we can consciously shape those. I mean, we can intervene in them. And
yes,
sort
in
of
fact,
will them, make them as we wish.
I mean, that's yes, although there's a bit of a paradox in putting it that way, because then you have to ask who the we is. Perhaps even a different way of putting it is that's what intervention would consist of, is that part of the brain engaging in the task of solving problems by trying out new combinations. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with what you said, just putting it a little differently.
But do you see anywhere on the horizon an era in which our understanding of the neurological processes, combined with our understanding of the sort of cognitive processes and combinatorial processes that you describe, that we'll be able to intervene at a neurological level in order to improve or change or enhance that cognitive process?
I tend to think the neurological enhancements are going to be fairly coarse. I think there could be drugs that improve memory and attention, kind of like drinking a strong cup of coffee, but better without the side effects.
Well, we read that a large percentage of, in this country we certainly read that a large percentage of academics in the US are popping Adderall and Ritalin to...
Yes, right. I have read that. Do you want to get some, by the way? No.
It's available on the internet.
I bet.
20% of Nature did a poll in January of this year.
Have tried them at least once.
20% of that,
yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are better drugs like that. I don't think we're going to have the science fiction scenarios of computer-brain interfaces that are actually implanted physically in the brain, just because I think our eyes and hands work so much better than any silicon interface is ever going to do. We already have those interfaces, and they're great, eyes and hands. I think they'll be there. I think the biggest improvements really are going to be more at the behavioral and cognitive and emotional levels rather than direct intervention, just because the brain is so staggeringly complex. I mean, there are things you can do I'm sure, to juice it up, to fix it when it breaks. I'm optimistic about the possibility of interventions that will aid recovery after strokes, that will treat forms of dementia. Whether they will, I don't think we'll ever get knowledge in a pill. I don't think we'll ever do voluntary surgery to make our brains better. With 100 trillion synapses and a staggering wiring diagram, it's going to defeat our best efforts for a long time.
But will we move towards, I mean, it seems to me that in contrast to physical health, we still have quite a sort of pathological vision of mental health. We sort of fix things when they're wrong. You know, we know when we use drugs or cognitive behavioral therapy or psychotherapy or a variety of interventions to sort of fix problems. But we don't really have in the same way, I think, a sense of mental fitness.
Mm-hmm.
although we do start to see, I mean, the programs in Pennsylvania and now in this country sort of using cognitive behavioural techniques with school children to sort of try and build sort of mental resilience. Do you think do you think we're likely to develop such a concept? And if so, how far is it likely to be neurological, or is it going to be about what works?
I think it's likely to be about what works. I think there are going to be limits. I don't think that we're either so malleable or that politically and morally we would allow authorities to mold us to the extent that we can be molded, that such a state of affairs would come into being. For one thing, there's genetic variation among people. Some people are just going to be more irritable than others. Some people are going to be happier than others. Some people are going to be smarter, better looking than others. And we're apt to, each of us, to favor our own point of view over others. So there are always going to be frictions and tensions and reasons to get depressed. On the other hand, I think there are ways of enhancing our wisdom. And no small part, I think, is realizing more clearly what human nature leaves us prone to do. If we know that we're likely to overvalue our own competence and our own benevolence, then that other part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, can factor that in and say, well, count to 10 before you get mad, or think of it from the other person's point of view. And I think that we've already enjoyed that kind of improvement. In many ways, this is a much nicer society than what we had 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so I do think that can improve, that can continue.
And we do seem to have seen a shift from a sort of rational man model in economics and psychology towards a sort of more behavioural, perhaps more realistic models. And I'm thinking Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory, or some of the work Dan Gilbert's done on sort of showing why we're not very good at predicting what makes us happy. I mean, is that a trend that you see and you see is likely to continue?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are enormous inroads that can be made, and that I think they do have the possibility of improving human happiness and welfare. I'll give you a personal example, because Dan is a friend and colleague of mine at Harvard. I was at MIT for 21 years, had a perfectly good job, and then got a job offer at Harvard. Had dinner with a number of what would be my prospective colleagues, such as Dan. And he was talking about this fallacy that you mentioned, that people overestimate their ability to predict what will make them happy. And he said when people face a tough decision, they often try to visualize what it would be like to be in one situation versus another. I'm not good at it. The best way to make a decision is to talk to someone else who is in that position.
Yes.
I've kind of thought about that, and so I spoke to two of my colleagues who made the switch from MIT to Harvard and asked them how their experience was. They listed a number of ways in which life was good for them, and I made my decision on that basis. If I just tried to do the thought experiment of sort of sit back and watch the mental movie of me in that office, I probably wouldn't have come to as good a decision as if I had taken his advice based on his own research, which can be applied to our decisions.
So again, a good example of research actually providing useful decision-making tools and helping us in very practical ways.
Very much, yes.
I wonder if we could move to talk about language a bit, because that's the subject of your latest book, The Stuff of Thought, and indeed of some of your previous books. One question I had reading The Stuff of Thought was, it's perhaps a sort of more philosophical question than a sort of concrete or useful one, but you talk in the book about how language sort of commits us to a factive view of the world. Mm-hmm. That when we use language, we make statements about things that do seem to commit us to a sort of fairly sort of common sense factive view of the world. But you also talk about how our experience of the sort of constant flow of events is always mediated through the way we construct it in language, through the sort of categories we put on it and the interpretations and the sort of construals that emerge. And indeed, at the end of the book, you use the analogy comparing language almost to Plato's cave, that it sort of shields us from. And I wondered if there was a paradox there, that on the one hand, language commits us to a factive view of the world, and on the other hand, it takes it away. It prevents us from ever having that factive experience.
Yeah, there is something of a paradox, and the factive semantics comes in especially with verbs like to know or to learn or to remember. So there's something very odd about saying that my friend Mitch knows that the moon is made of cheese.
Yes.
Even if Mitch is crazy and that's what he believes,
We wouldn't
you don't
say
use
that,
the verb
yeah.
know. When you use the verb know, you're committing yourself, you and your listener, to there being some objective reality that both of you can point to. That's why we have differences between verbs like to know and to think or to believe. And so we're committed to that, even though, as you point out, the very fact that language has a peculiar way of forcing us to pay attention to certain things in the world and not to others means that each of us doesn't necessarily get there. That is, we don't really know things except collectively in terms of the best understanding that our current science and history provides, but we talk as if we do. We use verbs like know, even though we really don't know what we know. So you're right, there's a kind of folk epistemology would be one way of putting it. That is, when we use the words of our language, we talk as if we can know things with certainty. And when we step back and put on our scientist hats, we realize that that can't be true, even though we ordinarily live our lives as if it is true.
So we move in and out of sort of different interpretive modes depending on what activity we're engaged in.
Exactly. And in fact, this relates to our earlier conversation of how a better understanding of what makes us tick can improve our lot. One of the hallmarks of the scientific mindset is to constantly doubt, to be skeptical, to demand evidence for assertions, to battle this tendency that you point out that we already know the way things work, as when we use the verb to know, and to realize we never really know something, although we try our darndest. But it's an uphill battle, and that we can't take our common sense intuitions of certainty seriously, but rather have to externalize it, justify it, scrutinize it, be skeptical of it, and so on.
That brings me on to my final question, which at the end of How the Mind Works, you talk about what philosophers call the hard problem.
Yes.
How can physical matter give rise to consciousness? And your suggestion, and I think this came out in what you just said as well, I think is that in a way it's the wrong question, that we don't need to know that. What's important is the very fact that we can be perplexed by it.
Yes, I think that on the one hand it helps an awareness of the possibility that our mind might be incapable of thinking of certain solutions to certain problems. Both helps delineate what we can study scientifically and what might be a waste of time. So I think the so-called easy problem of consciousness, namely what's the difference between conscious and unconscious processing and what are the neural correlates. Yes, I know it's kind of it's an in-joke to call it an easy problem because it's probably one of the hardest problems in science. But it's easy in the sense that it is a scientific problem. Whereas a problem like how do I know that your red is the same as my red, and if I were to scan all the molecules of my body and build an exact duplicate, would it be me or would it be someone else just like me? Those kind of college dorm late night bull session problems may be cases where the human mind just can't construe the right way of asking the question or wouldn't recognize a solution if there was one. As a psychologist, the reason I find this even more interesting is that it might say something about how our mind works. Right. Namely, what are the kinds of problems where we can have traction, come up with satisfying answers, and what are the kinds of problems that just leave us befuddled in paradox and mystery and vertigo and so on. And there's a suggestion from the philosopher Colin McGinn, who's the one who's most strongly articulated this position, that our minds are good at combinatorial thinking. That is, if you can break down matter into molecules and into atoms and into subatomic particles and have rules that predict how combinations will behave, if you can take a process and write it down as a set of equations and symbols where the properties of the equation depend on how the symbols are arranged, there we seem to really make progress. But all of these puzzles and ancient problems of philosophy seem holistic. Consciousness, for example, doesn't get simpler when you go from how you recognize a face to how you perceive the color red. The redness of red is just as mysterious as the sense of my perception of your face. And so when you have something that doesn't get simpler when you break it down, then there's a kind of everywhere at once, all at the same timeness about those problems that seems to make them particularly challenging to a human brain. And it's maybe problems of that sort that keep us befuddled.
Professor Finkel, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.